Hello. In the Crown of Aragon 639 years ago, it was May 27th, 1387. My name is Jonathan Seyfried. I'm a PhD candidate in history at the University of New Mexico, and this is the Historian's Notebook, a podcast about how history gets made. Season 1 is titled Moltcara Companiona. We're looking at a document from each day of the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violant de Bar. Let's begin today's document. Today's document is from the Curiae Sigilli Secreti Register of Violant, and she is writing to the ambassadors in Avignon. And for those of you that have been listening for the last couple weeks, you know that when Violant is writing to that particular set of recipients, it's going to involve something more personal and also likely to reveal quite a lot about the condition of Joan's health. And today is no exception. We hear in this letter that Joan's health has not been a steady upwardly progressing recovery, but that there has been a very serious relapse. And Violant actually uses the word for relapse, a recrua, like a recurrence. En aquesta recrua is what she says in line 6. The letter, I think I'll just kind of go line by line summarizing the letter. So it starts out by saying, we're going to give you an update on the status of the king. There have been some grave accidents, right? So again, I think we'd better really think about how to translate that word accident. Something like misfortune, but I don't know. I think maybe we can even say attacks in terms of a health attack, but we'll have to just keep thinking about that. So that's line 1. Line 2 is pinning down the timeline of when the most recent fever came to the said Lord. And it was Saturday, so about the 5th word in on line 2, we have the word for Saturday, but then we have an additional temporal specificity here. We have apre que la luna fo renovada. So it's after the moon had reached its renewal. It's basically at the new moon, right? So the OpenClaw pipeline generated this idea that this mention of the moon is connected to the medieval belief that the stars, the celestial bodies, had a big impact on the health conditions of individuals on Earth. And I think that that is a good connection to bring out. I'm not entirely convinced that Violant is saying that it's because of the new moon that the fever hit Joan, because she placed in the earlier, well, the thing that started this all on on April 28th. When Violant is writing about what happened on April 28th, she's specific about the time. She says that it's at sunset, but maybe that's just actually another connection, and both can be true, that she wants to be specific about the time, and then also she is observing the connection that was a commonly held belief between the celestial bodies and the condition of people on Earth and their health conditions. It is definitely the case that when there were people trained in the care of the human body, doctors, physicians, they would, in medical school, they would spend more time studying astrology and astronomy than they would studying anatomy. That is a fun fact that really reveals quite a lot about how in the medieval worldview for Western Europe, there was a very, very definite connection between what was happening up in the stars and conditions on Earth. And when there was a surgery being planned, when it was not like an emergency surgery, but it was the kind of surgery that you could schedule for a particular day, the doctors would take care to schedule the surgery on a day when the stars were in a particular alignment that would bode well for the success of the surgery. And I think even saying bode well is putting it too lightly. They would ensure that they did not do a surgery on a day when the stars were against them. You can put it that way. So I think that was a nice little flag from the agentic AI process that maybe I would have just kind of not thought of otherwise. So just kind of keep noting the presence of the AI co-intelligence here. And, we're now looking at stuff that was generated over a month ago from the agentic AI because I don't know, like the news about agentic AI these days is that if you're being a little bit careless, you could end up exposing yourself to all kinds of malware. And so I have not really done anything else with agentic AI since I did this OpenClaw routine over a month ago. All right, let's get back to the document. So line 3 mentions the doctors. In line 3, Violant says that the fever that had struck on Saturday, it continued all day, and I think that means into Sunday, because of course, like the moon is at night, like the full moon reveals itself at night. So I think we're talking about going into Sunday. And so what we're talking about in terms of the dates is 2 days prior to this letter was the Saturday. So Violant is writing this on a Monday. The phrase about the doctors is an interesting one. Quels metges no han be conegut. That particular phrase and the use of conegut, it makes me think that the phrase is overall saying that the doctors did not recognize well. They had not recognized it well. So the doctors are still at a loss. And this brings to mind the document that we talked about the day before yesterday, which is Violant trying to get a hold of a spell of counter magic, counter curses, in order to go beyond doctors and bring in a little bit of the spiritual realm into trying to help Joan recover. Then in line 4, we say that Violant says that after the... So something about how after that day, I'm trying to figure this out. Okay, after that day, Joan was estat net. So net is like a word for clean, but it could also mean clear, like cleared of the illness, like the fever broke. So this was a fever that hit on Saturday night, but then it seems like after the end of Sunday, the fever broke. But then we get some interesting stuff in the next couple lines. So then in line 4 in the second half, Violant goes back in time a little bit further. And she says that there were days that Joan, had been strong. And it was like some days more than others. So there's this idea being conveyed here that it's been a bumpy road, that some days Joan is strong and other days he's not. And that's been the status seemingly since, I guess, April 28th, when he almost died. And then in line 5, we get to talking about Saturday again. We get, Friday and Saturday that had just passed. So maybe, oh gosh, I'm getting a little tangled up here in the meaning as I'm trying to translate this. But Abgran Kongusha. Something about how, Gran Kongusha. I think that means with great sadness. So basically, what's being conveyed here is Joan has been strong on some days and in danger on some other days. And last week, what happened on the weekend was of great sadness. And then in the next line, we get this phrase, altres accidents, que havets en aquesta recrua. So basically, other accidents, other health attacks, and it's identified as a relapse, recrua. And then this next phrase is really something. Ha estat en espacial. And then we've got 5 or 6 days that he has not been able to sleep. So whatever the illness is making it so that he is not able to sleep, which puts an entirely different view on Joan's experience with this. It's got to be pretty torturous, where he's not able to sleep, he's got these fevers that are recurring, and so it all seems just like agony at this point. And so then Violant wraps up the letter by saying, please continue to pray for the Lord King. And then we've got the dating clause. And interestingly, we have at the end of that dating clause, the word rex is crossed out. I can't quite figure out why. Bartolomeo Sirvent, who's the scribe here, would have initially put Rex. It's definitely not Regina. And instead he puts secretore or secretorum. So that is a mysterious little note at the end of the text block. And then we've got the probata, pretty normal probata. We have Bartolomeo Sirvent at the beginning of it, and then I actually have a transcription of this document from two historians, one of whom we've already heard about on the podcast, Jaume Riera y Sanz, and then Mateo Rodrigo Lizondo. The two of them put together a document collection of transcriptions, and this document is included. So even though the handwriting, good old Bartolomeo Sirvent does an excellent job of a handwriting, is pretty good, and I can read everything. It was nice to have that transcription. Then I could also compare it to just my own understanding as well as what comes through in the OpenClaw pipeline. So this is a good one to work with in terms of a test to see about the quality of the OpenClaw pipeline output, which, I have to say for Catalan letters is really good. And I brought that up. I brought up how this is a document that I do have a transcription for from skilled historians. And so they had the probata read Bartolomeo Sirvat mandato Domine Regine. So ordered by the Lady Queen. And then they also had facto per hac me Castellani, milite consuli e camerlencum. So they know how to do the endings of the words in this. They know the declensions. I do not. And so I just messed it up there because I don't have it in front of me right now, what they did. But basically, we have, instead of like a mandawat mihi, we have a mandato. And I think what that means is that we maybe don't have quite as much of a personal involvement in this letter versus some of the others, which is interesting because this is revealing some very personal information. If I were just to be looking at this document without paying attention to the probata, I would say to myself, well, only Violant would include such personal details like how Joan has not been able to sleep for 5 or 6 days. I think that Violant might have dictated this to Jaume Castellani, and then Jaume Castellani wrote it, and then Bartolomeo Sirvent copied it. And that would be how we would still get Violant's personal touch on this letter, and an understanding that she herself made a decision about what details to reveal. And at the same time, we've got a probata that lacks the mandawat mihi, which in my mind is still what you have to have in order to say that the monarch wrote it themselves. So it's interesting to think about how much of an authorship we can attribute to this document from Violant herself. And this is a good example of just trying to really figure that out, which is not easy, because I feel like the probatas are sometimes used, in the same, they have the same formula for sometimes different levels of authorship, but maybe not. Maybe I'm just needing to continue my own practice here, and then it'll become more and more clear as we go into the second half of the year. All right, let's just take a step back and think about how the description of Joan's health in this document relates to what we have been hearing throughout the month of May. So we do have moments in the month of May, and here, this is where we get into the historical thinking skill of corroboration. We have moments in the month of May where it really seems like it was Joan who was instigating communication. Like especially on May 17th, 18th, and 19th, when we had those 3 letters in which Joan is shopping for hunting animals. That seems to me like it must have been a period where, as phrased in today's document, he was more strong than in other days. And then if we look at maybe the May 21st document, where we have a letter to the Bishop of Elna saying that the pirate that he has imprisoned should be sent to Barcelona. Maybe that particular document was not from Joan at all. And also the more recent one that we did yesterday, the town that was not paying its fair share. I guess, well, fair is definitely a word that might not apply here. But anyway, it owed the crown some money. That obviously would not necessarily be something Joan would have had to author. But my question is about the finances. So there's all of these documents that we looked at in May where, and it's kind of like early May, where all of this financial wheeling and dealing with the de Muntos or the de Muntros family is going on, and especially all of the Mogabels that are mentioned from the May 12th document. Was that Joan, or was this more of a group decision to handle the finances in this way? It's a pretty interesting question because it gets into the historiography of Joan's reign, where Joan himself has been really criticized for financial irresponsibility. But, you know, if we're seeing that his staff, his counselors, were really the ones that were making these decisions, and Joan himself could, barely get out of bed, right, and couldn't sleep and was just in this horrendous physical condition, well, we have to kind of take a step back from making a judgment about his quality of leadership and consider, well, how do historians make these assessments of a particular reign? Of course, Joan recovers and goes on to have moments of high activity as a monarch, but when we're looking at what gets established as just the way of doing business for this reign, I think there's perhaps a question of momentum or established practices that seem to work in the early days and might just kind of then continue to be the way they do things. And so should you make a big change if it's kind of the way that things have been set up and are currently running? I think that's a really interesting question. Like, how much agency should we attribute to Joan later on? It's really clear that right now he does not have much agency over the major financial operation of the royal treasury. Like, there's just no way that he is in a condition to shape things there. And so he's just trying to stay alive. And remember, we have a document coming up one that, oh gosh, I was really hoping that I would hear from the archive of the Barcelona Cathedral about whether they might do a scan of this document for me. I put in a request. It's been about 10 days through their web form, and I'm not sure that I'm going to get anything from them. But you know what? On May 31st, we're going to talk about that document anyway, even though we don't have that document in an image right now. I think it's a super important one, and maybe we'll just do 2 documents for that day with that in mind, so that we do have some kind of, image from the archive to look at. But remember that on May 31st, there's this letter to Berenguer Moret, who's the ambassador to Pisa, and someone in Barcelona is writing to him saying that the word on the street is that Joan is not going to survive this. So outside the palace walls, the mood becomes pessimistic really soon, or maybe it already is. And the real question is, does Violant think that this is the end? That is something interesting to ponder. But, we will see that Joan makes it through. And the question is, what was his condition? What was his capacity during this time? And it's difficult to tell, because we get letters like today's, and then we also get letters that are attributed to him that makes it seem like he's in charge. So we will just continue to navigate those questions and keep in mind the really important interpretive lens of disability studies, where we have, in this situation, when we're talking about an elite person, we have a lot of accommodation taking place that covers over their disability and seeks to make it invisible. So all of the chancery operations, all of the different people that are high up in the government, all of the functionaries and bureaucrats, they all work together in order to try to make Joan's disability invisible, and they can only do so much. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Historian's Notebook, Season 1, Molt Cara Companiona. If you are leaving with more questions than you arrived with, I've done my job. Remember, the motto of The Historian's Notebook is dissatisfaction guaranteed. Visit the website to see an image of today's document and additional show notes, and listen again tomorrow to hear about the next day in the first year of the reign of King Joan I of Aragon and Queen Violant de Bar. In the meantime, take care.